Hello and welcome to Roll2Cast, a tabletop RPG podcast with both actual plays and interviews. I'm Chris, and this week I'm joined around the table by Sean.
Hello.
And Ellen.
Hello.
Following the end of Season 2's actual play of Vampire the Masquerade, we continue our inter-season content as we're joined this week by a wonderful man. He's the developer of Vampire the Requiem's first edition, was the co-designer of Exalted, and has authored over 100 Vampire the Masquerade / Requiem books. And that's just for starters. We're excited to get to know our guest, Justin Achilli.
Woo!
Did you call me a wonderful man?
A
wonderful man.
I may have misspoke, Justin.
Wow.
How are you?
That is one hell of an introduction. This is great.
You deserve it.
We really need to insert some applause, because that was just you really ought to be walking onto a stage just then to receive some kind of accolade.
It's for my future career as a talk show host. How are you, Justin?
I'm doing pretty well. I woke up about an hour and a half ago. I ate. I have something to drink. Everything's square over here. It's good.
Fantastic.
You're looking after your body. That's what we like to hear.
Yeah.
For listeners, the time zones are a bit funny here. It's 9:30 over where you are, Justin, and here it's nearing midnight.
Yeah, we're not doing so hot. I'll tell you right now.
I've got you punchy. You've got me fresh. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah.
What I love about this entire kind of scenario is how this came about. Because Justin, just to pull back the veil a bit, we were you were a person that we really wanted to hopefully get a chance to even just say, hi, would you like to come on our podcast? And we were trying to think of ways to how might we get in touch with you. And so we're trying to figure out, is there a public email, or is there an account that we can go through? That was kind of Chris's job. And then he kind of comes to me about a day or so later and he goes, hey, guess who's being followed by Justin on Twitter? I'm like, who? He's like, fucking you.
I'm not the guy who's played Justin's games for maybe 10 or 15 years.
This isn't a game. This isn't a game of who Daddy loves most, Chris.
We're playing Vampire. Of course it is. The answer is Kane. Justin, I talked you up quite a lot in that intro, but you really have written a significant amount of the Vampire Masquerade and the Vampire Requiem canon. You're a prolific writer. You've written and I believe designed for video games as well. That's quite a lot. Let's pull it right back. How did you get into writing in the beginning?
Okay, let's see. I was actually playing live-action role-playing games at the time when Mike Tinney, who was then running the Night Owl kind of subsection of White Wolf, the live action arm of White Wolf, came to host a game in Dallas, Texas, where I was living at the time. My girlfriend and I went and played in the game, and I just met and hung out with Mike. It turned out weirdly, he had forgotten a pair of socks, so I took him to get a pair of socks while he was staying. So we had kind of I got to spend some personal time with one of the company guys.
Strengthens the friendship.
At the time, he was working on moving out from Night Owl to working on the Rage collectible card game. So a couple weeks, maybe a couple months later, he gave me a call back or an email back, I don't even remember at this point, and said, hey, we got this project coming up. Would you like to work on it? I guess he got some kind of sense that I was, fairly organized and could turn shit in on time. I don't know. But basically, the job came up through having played live action games. And then I got in, basically my foot in the door was working on card games. And at that point, after about a year, I guess, or so, working on the card game, they were trying to spin the Dark Ages RPG line up into a fully supported line. So not just a one-off, they wanted full support for it. So they opened up a position. I said, I would love to do that. And there it happened.
And this would have been around 1995, if I'm remembering dates right?
Yeah, I started in, I think, March or April of 95, and then 96, 97, I was doing Dark Ages.
So can I just point out that I'm pretty certain Ellen wasn't even alive in 1995?
I was gestating.
You know what? I love that sort of thing. Was it nice and warm on the inside, I guess? I don't know.
Look, my mum has a cold, cold heart, so I'm going to say no. You know what? I wouldn't. I'm glad I came out into a world with such wonderful writings and game systems abound.
It's kind of interesting because you mentioned that you're a part of the LARP scene, Justin. Were you involved with kind of tabletops and LARPs from a young age? Because like for myself and Ellen, we've only really started getting into tabletops in general for the past couple of years, where Chris has been going for well over a decade, if not longer. So how did kind of you get into that scene to begin with, and what kind of spurned your love of tabletops?
I got into it comparatively young, I think, and it's a fairly standard story there, like literally playing D&D in my cousin's basement.
Yep.
I was probably 7 or 8 years old, right? And so we're hanging out in the concrete basement, listening to Rush. There's some posters on the wall. And I'm an elf falling into a trap. And so, it was, I think, a fairly standard introduction there. And so I played games throughout elementary school, maybe a little bit into junior high. I fell out a little bit in high school, but then got back into it weirdly when, like I was saying earlier, my girlfriend and I went to go play this LARP. I started dating this woman, and she said, hey, there's this game where you play vampires and werewolves, and we were both big Anne Rice fans. And so I said, oh, yeah, I know what kind of games those are. I used to play those when I was younger. So like I always laugh about this part of the interview, but like my girlfriend got me back into gaming.
There you go. The tables have turned.
Fellas, listen to the ladies.
I have a question about, kind of LARP, but I think I was listening to another interview where you were talking about how a vampire is kind of like a lifestyle over a game. Like there's a big influence in a kind of culture of vampire and the dressing up and the role playing, and that now being taken to podcasting and people participating in watching people perform vampire. Like, why do you think that happens over maybe D&D or some other kind of role-playing games?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually something I think D&D 5th edition has done really well, is they've kind of turned, they're not just selling games, right? They're selling kind of accessories that go with it. They're really selling you kind of lifestyle. There's this almost like Starbucks approach to it. But Vampire, I thought, had that a little earlier on. Like I remember, not only were we making the game, but we were going out like every night in Atlanta, back when White Wolf was in Atlanta. Every night there was a specific club night that kind of catered to, the dark interests, whether it's goth subculture or, tonight's industrial night or whatever. But, it wasn't just a game. It was, like you say, it was more of a lifestyle. And for me, I've always loved the night. I've always been fascinated with kind of the beauty of darkness, and, not to oversell it or sound like a teenager there. But, there is kind of a wonder in almost the forbidden. And that kind of translates above and beyond RPGs. And so what Vampire did was kind of take that lifestyle and say, you can kind of play it with this subset of rules. Here's vampires, here's werewolves, here's wizards and ghosts and that sort of stuff. So it took, I think, things that people were doing anyway and just moved them into the familiar environment of RPGs, of tabletop games.
That makes sense. Like it's so hard to access all those themes, but when you have a kind of limitations, it somehow makes the game more fun, makes it more fun to play within this moral question of what's right, what's wrong, what can I touch, what can't I touch.
As someone who writes and who does game design, like I love that sort of the constraint you're talking about there, right? Like just completely open-ended. A game can be about anything. All right, well, you're going to have a hard time hooking someone.
Yeah.
But when it becomes a question of morality, when you say, like, hey, we're going to explore some dark themes here, or you're the bad guy fighting against being the bad guy, all of a sudden, you've got this very, very specific but very, very fallow field to start exploring.
We'll get back to you as a designer, but as a writer, how did you start? Because that's quite a lot to be kind of thrust into this at the time quite, and still now, quite prolific game company. How was the transition? Were you drawing on skills that you'd already developed and were honing in, or was this, oh, I have to write now. Okay, time to write.
I had always been interested in writing. I had taken classes in school to kind of help me polish the craft there. So it's been something that I had been doing at the time for, let's say, years. But one of the big things that's different between just writing and making games and design is like cleaving to a publishing schedule, working something into a publishable draft and getting it off to, a graphic designer and into layout and into like a printable form, that's suddenly where you start acquiring these skills that are way outside the realm of, just committing ideas to paper. So that I think was an opportunity for me to do something that I loved, which was writing, and then kind of cultivate it into a bigger and even more broadly applicable skill set of overall publishing. So that was the big leap for me, less so the writing, which I was already comfortable doing, and more so the turning it into quote unquote product. I hate the word product, but it's turning it into something that someone could buy and sit down and read and carry with them, that kind of thing.
For some writers, they have quite a difficult time holding to schedule. So for you, that transition wasn't difficult at all. The process of your own writing, those were skills that you were adding to. It didn't disrupt your own established writing process.
Yeah, that's an amazing question, because there was, like you say, there was this huge spectrum at White Wolf. There was kind of the traditional creative tornado type who, like, it's 5 a.m. and I had this great idea and I'm going to bang it out, write it down. Like, not me, man. I work from this hour to this hour, and my creativity is, I've kind of cultivated it to be the most functional in those spaces. So being able to fit the schedule actually, I think, was probably easier for me than someone who, like Phil Brucato, who had worked on Mage. Like, he's one of those guys who, when inspiration hits, like, bang, he's at the computer, and it doesn't matter whether it's day or night or whether he's out and about or in, home in his office, whatever there. So for me, I thought the transition was a little easier, but it was always something you could see, like in the office. You go in, and for whatever reason, somebody is working on a draft at 2 a.m, or someone is trying to get this thing laid out and off to the printer. And like, for me, oh no, that was hours ago.
Yeah,
it's quitting time, guys. I'm going to the pub.
I'm sorry. The fact that you say that a consistent and reliable writer exists in the world, I'm shook to my very core. I just don't understand how that works.
I mean, everybody's creative process is different, right? And I'm not trying to say like, oh, if you do it the right way, like I do, you can be, it can be flawless for you. Quite the opposite. Everyone kind of finds their groove. Everyone finds the way that they are the most effective.
Their kind of personal best practice. When you look back on your writing, do you see common themes or deliberate tonal decisions or a sort of practice which you use to convey whatever you're looking to achieve, whether that's little tricks that you've picked up or anything in that realm?
For me personally, the biggest impetus to write is literally having something to say. Like, I'm not a person who can take a piece of paper and just start noodling and eventually the idea will come out. I generally, before I start writing, I don't necessarily have an outline, but I know what I want to start talking about as I write. And for a long time, you can see, you can for every developer who worked on Vampire, they explored different themes. Everything always kind of came back to the same foundation for them. And for me, especially early on as I was working on it, I was looking at vampires as basically substance abusers, right? Like, they are all addicts to vitae, to blood. And, at the time I was a pretty heavy drinker myself. So there was a lot of kind of personal experience that I could filter through that vampire lens, as it were. And that's changed over time for me. Like right now I see vampires as people who just kind of take and take and take from society or from the world and literally give nothing back. Like, all they do is exist to extract. Having that kind of framework, having that kind of sense that or that lens that you're looking through with your writing, or that filter that you're trying to commit to paper, I think is a huge creative benefit because it keeps you focused. And, there's always something more to say if you know what you're going to say. And that's why so many of the games push this idea of, when you start your chronicle, know what your theme is. If you don't have a theme, if you're just going to kind of aimlessly wander around, you're probably not going to engage your players very well. But if you have something that the chronicle is trying to say, that's always something that will come through that, the players can make their decisions based on, and you can always have the consequences to those decisions kind of reinforce that. So, not only is that true in writing, it's true in gameplay at the table as well.
If Vampire, like you said, has a particular lens, what do you think it is in terms of it allowing to heighten certain attributes in writing? Do you think Vampire or any of the other White Wolf or any other properties really have particular lenses that you are attracted to? Obviously, I'm thinking of Vampire because so much of your writing is in that genre. Mm-hmm. Are there any particular things that you like about it? Because like you said, it began as they're kind of addicts and now they're kind of mindless consumers. Why does Vampire highlight qualities that you like, for instance?
Regardless of what the theme is, it always, to me, comes back to, as well, an exploration of morality. And that is something that has been true for me, like even outside of my White Wolf work. I don't like to typically work on games where like you just, hey, wander through the scene and kill people, right? Like I'm not super interested in shooters or things like that, but I'm always interested in stuff where, if you have to make a choice, what are the consequences of that choice? And that always feels extra resonant to me when there's morality. Like if you just tell me I'm the good guy and I'm wandering through the game, just killing people left and right, am I really the good guy? Are you just telling me, or am I basically consuming propaganda almost? Yeah. Right. So, Vampire and the World of Darkness overall has always been really good for exploring, that morality, which I think is just personally very interesting. But as well, one of the things that I love about the World of Darkness is how kind of lush and oversaturated it is. It's very sensory. It's something where, the kind of the color is turned up to 11 on it. And, you can smell, having grown up, or not grown up, but having worked so much in Atlanta, there's kind of a Southern Gothic sense to it, where I can pick up the magnolia on the air, and it's very humid, so I can feel just there's a tactile difference in going outside on your skin, and all of that just feels so World of Darkness to me. And I think for a lot of people can kind of transplant to their own individual locations, right? I've never been to Australia, but I imagine there's something that feels very distinct about being in Australia, and that is perfect fodder for sensory description when you run a World of Darkness game there.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a genre of our own called the Australian Gothic, which explores the heat of the Australian desert and the sort of isolation that we have, which I think being part of the LARP community and the kind of vampire community for so many years, it definitely permeates into most of what we do. I wanted to ask about, you know what? My brain's just stopped.
I've got a question in the meantime.
Sorry, John. No, I was like, no, I've got a question. I'm going to lead up to something. No, I don't actually.
I feel like you were so knocked back by all the evocative and lush imagery and the sensation of all the.
I was just transplanted
the word images that we were painting for you, Chris, and you were just held, fixated upon them.
Justin, you were chatting about kind of your writing process before. I'm kind of interested because I think on directors like James Cameron and Christopher Nolan, who kind of sit on ideas until the circumstances or the year or kind of a time and the place are just right. These are ideas that they kind of foster over time. And as someone who can't just, as you say, you can't just get up and write as a time as it dictates, do you find that when you're working on, say, a system, whether it be Requiem or Masquerade, and whether it's in a time period, you have to kind of sit on an idea and wait until you're in the right time or place or circumstance? Have there been instances of that, or can you find generally that a lot of your ideas do match the product that you're working on at a given time? I
think it's something that you generally train yourself toward to do. So you can, well, not necessarily everybody. Again, the process is individual, but I actually benefit from, I was talking a little bit about creative constraint before, and time can literally be one of those creative constraints. So, I can literally know, hey, my best hours are between 10:30 and 1 o'clock. I may be a little bit hungry, so but before I get fully hungry and distracted, there's always a peak hour. And so kind of your best stuff will often fall into, if you do observe that kind of rigor, your best stuff, you will have a kind of window that you can find. But there's also always stuff that, I don't want to describe it as filler, but there's always like the connective tissue, right? Or there's always editing you can do. Or there's always, hey, I got that scene out, I got it written down. Now I need to go back and hone it or craft it or take the rough edges off. So I think generally, as you talk about Nolan or Cameron, they have their big idea, and a lot of the actual work goes in taking that big idea and making it, translating it into the form of media that they specialize in. Obviously making a movie is very different from, writing a piece of written fiction, but there's always kind of support work to be done for it. And sometimes that's literally like, I have a book that I wrote on my own and just organizing the thing, right? Like just breaking it out into individual chapters, and each chapter was a separate document, and I had them all numbered correctly. And so like dealing with that sort of bullshit is important, because otherwise you've got just like this pile of writing. It's effectively just a scribble, right? Unless you can use it, it's just a jumble of words. And so being able to kind of organize all of that stuff, that's the hard part. It's not the glamorous part, but it's the stuff that needs done. And so I'm glad that I can kind of, when I'm not at a creative high, there's always that work. You know, I like the organizational part of it as well. I think for a lot of people, the organizational part is a bit of a turnoff. But, you know, if you're going to be able to make something that you're able to put in front of somebody else, some amount of that has to be done.
Well, I think you talking about it as connective tissue kind of belies what you mean by that. Like, it's all still part of it. Editing and shaping it is all still, you know, even chapter titles, like they are part and fundamentally the construct that you're building. Speaking of media, what about you? What are your sorts of what do you like to watch on a TV, film, or books that you like to consume? What influences you as a person?
Or even theatre, may we dare say.
As theatre actors, we have to ask that question.
It's fine if you don't.
In high school, I actually was in theater briefly, like I think probably just my freshman year, and I churned out of that. So that wasn't the environment for me. I'm not a big theater fan. You know, not to denigrate it or anything, of course. It's just not my preferred media.
Yeah.
But I go through gluts. I'll go through periods of time where like I'm going to watch this entire series, you know, on Netflix, or you know, I'm going to read this entire series of books. There's a book I'm reading right now, The Trader, Baruch Cormorant by Seth. I forget the last name of it. It's over on my shelf. It's not. I don't think it's Seth Rogen.
That's a good
but
choice.
it's you know, part of a bigger series, and I've just started reading it. I just finished watching on Netflix. There was this. Of course, I just watched The Last Kingdom again recently, so I've been with that through all 4 seasons. I just watched a show called The Protector on Netflix, which is this kind of hidden mystery. It takes place in Istanbul, and so there's this kind of historically reoccurring protector who protects the city from these horrible immortals. And it's, you know, they're not quite vampires, but there's this greater sense of beauty and history. And if you scratch a little deeper, you can find, you know, beneath the surface all these mysteries happening in the world. So I like that kind of stuff. Last night I watched the Richard III, the one back from 1995 with Robert Downey and Ian McKellen in it. So I'm kind of all over the place right now.
So you do like theatre. Trying to sneak that past us.
I knew I wasn't going to get that past you.
When you're writing, do you seek out media that's applicable to what you're writing for in the genre or tone that you're looking for, or do you tend to already draw from what you've got?
That is a great question. In general, I try to avoid the genre or the ideas that I'm specifically writing in at the time, because I think kind of subconsciously you're always influenced by that sort of thing. And I want there to be as much kind of originality to the work I'm doing as possible. But at the same time, I'm fucking writing about vampires, right? So there's kind of a cultural worldwide precedent that I'm going to be drawing from at some point. So, you know, I like there to be things that if you like vampires, you might like this vampire thing that I've worked on. There, you know, there needs to be something in the DNA there. But overall, I think while I'm working, I put on music in the background, and there's rarely any lyrics in the music I'm listening to while writing, or it's in a language I don't speak, so I'm not distracted by the lyrics. But I think probably my immediate mood while writing is more directly affected by that music than it is by something I'm reading, you know, before bedtime or watching at dinner time.
In terms of like getting into the mood of writing, or you were kind of talking about the bullshit that comes with writing, like all the technical constraints, do you find that makes it kind of easier when you're jumping from medium to medium? Like, you know, what's the difference between writing for a video game as opposed to a tabletop RPG? Like, there's technical limitations, and do you find that kind of helps you get into the zone, or how do you kind of approach tackling something that exists in a different medium?
I hadn't thought about that until you brought it up just now. But like when I sit down to write, you know, fiction for myself, or you know, something for a book, I'm writing in generally a word processor. But when you are writing for video games, you are at times, and probably other people you talk to on the podcast will be able to corroborate this. But like sometimes you're writing in Excel. right? Like sometimes you're literally writing lines of dialogue that fit into one cell on a spreadsheet, and that is not a conducive environment to writing very creatively. I was working on a project recently where I was literally writing in an engine, like in the game engine. It's almost lines of code, except it's not, right? It's lines of dialogue. And I mean, again, also not very conducive to, it just doesn't have the tools in place for script writing.
I'm sorry, but I have a big question on this. Why? You were writing in an engine? Like, okay. I just have several.
So the way it worked was you wrote in engine because attached to the engine was the localization tool. So you write into the engine, so immediately you can test the validity of your work. You can have the character run around and say dialogue line X, and the character will say it. So that all works. But then that is all then at some point automated output to a localization manager. So, it's a game that's going to be handled in, 8, 10, 12 languages. So everything you do then is managed in that tool. And so the repository for writing is usually in parallel on that tool, but because of the import-export process, it happened in the engine. So stuff you wrote in the tool, which you had previously used to write, which got pushed into the engine for whatever reason on this project, that had been reversed, right? They, I think, wanted a little bit more of a quick prototyping sort of situation, like, see this stuff in the game real time, as opposed to wait for an import from the localization tool. Super not sexy, not amazingly fun to talk about, and not thrilling to write in.
It's hell for you, but it's helpful for everyone else.
Yes.
It would be like if you wrote out a script on individual little like fortune cookie pieces of paper and like handed that to the actor while still running around on stage.
Well, you didn't hand them to them. You had a handful of them and you just kind of threw them at them and hope they land in a logical sequence. So.
I do have a question in terms of, this is something that I asked Mike Pondsmith. Because you have gone through this career for a number of years and you've written, what has Chris said, in excess of 100 books, you get to kind of look...
Is this your way of calling me old? Is that what's going on here?
Look, I've been giving digs at you the entire episode. I apologize. I'm trying to make myself feel big. We don't
want to say the O word. Experienced is what we say here.
But I feel you do get a chance to kind of look back on kind of your career as a whole and kind of everything you've done and extrapolate lessons from that, whether they be positive or negative. Have you kind of had time and look back at whether they are things you've realized are just the way you fundamentally work correctly for yourself, or lessons you've learned over time where you can look back on a lot of your older things and go, okay, that's something that I would never do now, but I'm fucking glad I know that now.
Writing is very much like any skill. It's even almost like physical strength. Like, the more you work out, the stronger you get. The more you break those muscle fibers, the stronger they grow back, blah, 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 blah. And so like the more you write, the more better you will make words at shit. The more you write, the better you become at the craft of it, right? And so, there's earlier stuff where I relied a lot on kind of tone and less on, readability or craft, or, I'm guilty of trying to shock here and there, less so now than I did earlier on. Some of the earlier vampire work that I did, things like in the Giovanni Clan book, were definitely kind of spikes of strangeness or, trying to provoke the audience. And I think there's definitely places for that, but that's not necessarily the stuff that I personally want to do anymore. So, if I were managing a game line, I would look for someone else who is, hey, you're really good at provoking the audience, whereas I'm better at building a greater sense of world, or whatever I want from that particular writer, whatever strength they bring to it. And so I think it's just a question of looking back and willing to not be embarrassed by your older stuff. There's always it's kind of like looking at a picture of yourself, like, oh God, look what we wore back in those days, or oh God, look how we wrote back in those days. But that's helping you, right? It's part of the journey, and so you need to make mistakes. You need to have stuff that you can look back on and either be embarrassed about or cringe about, but it's helping move you forward. And I'm a firm believer in the idea that the moment you think you have nothing left to learn, that's the beginning of your decline right there. And so if you always look at your creative body of work and think, hey, this is me getting better, and even the bad stuff is me learning what not to do, that's a perspective that I think will always serve you well.
In terms of collecting all of that or collating of that, do you have any advice for someone starting out as a writer working in tabletop RPGs?
I think the most important thing, like literally the most important thing, just write something. If it's, starting with a blog, great. If it's writing adventures or scenarios that only your group consumes at the table, great. And you can shop those around. You can use those when you go to different publishers and say, look at their submission guidelines and say, oh, they're looking for this, I can submit this piece of work, or oh, they're looking for this, I will need to make something new, but I've learned from writing for my table or writing for my blog to do this. You need to write. Just do it. There's a lot of people who I think like the idea of being a writer more than they like writing. And, I don't want to condemn anybody, but having a word processor doesn't make you a writer. Like writing makes you a writer.
Yeah.
You can be a shitty writer. You can be a learning writer. You can be a magnificent writer. You can be a writer, in transition to the best writer you will ever be, but you need to be doing it. Never let that part of it fall to the wayside. And this, I think, is particularly frustrating. There's a great democratization of the kind of desktop publishing era where anybody can publish anything. And so a lot of times you get yourself lost in the weeds, like, do I have the right program for this? Or, oh, I'm going to lay this out. And, I've only got a paragraph now, but when I come back to it and write it, I'm going to do it in this format. It's going to be beautiful. Well, the first step is just get that raw material, get the writing done, and then you can craft it into something that you can turn into a submission, or you can craft it into something that you can publish yourself, or you can craft it into something that serves as a writer's test if you're going for like a script writing job in, computer games or something like that. But being able to do the thing that you're trying to do, you got to buckle down and do it.
So you're saying me writing everything on the back of receipt paper is in fact a good thing, and my co-writer should not be incredibly pissed off with me?
Well, co-writing is an entirely different situation. So now all that bullshit I talked about having to do for my own work, well, now you're pushing that onto somebody else. So
You're now
there's definitely
mediator.
give and take there.
I was going to say, as actors, we fully agree with the just do it mentality, but thanks for spinning that, Ellen. That was
Thanks for completely reading me there.
Justin, you've, as a person who's interested and as someone who wrote for them, you must play role-playing games. Do you have any games currently going?
Imagine if you said no.
No, I hate them.
I like, there's an appeal to me to both the long form game and the short form game. And I really like one shots. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people don't like them. And weirdly, I think the World of Darkness is not extremely well suited to one shots because, if you're trying to tell these morality tales, you can do it in a short story. But a lot of times consequence is on a slow burn in the World of Darkness or horror, where until 3 episodes down the road, you only find out who the big bad guy is or who the mysterious conspirator is. So for World of Darkness style games, I like and prefer those to be kind of chronicle style, right, over a period of time. And right now, under quarantine, there's not a huge amount of structure in place for me to be able to do that. Right now, I've got a kind of ongoing, as we pick it up, episodic D&D 5 game that, whenever everyone can get together, we can all, move dudes around the little grid online. We're doing a virtual tabletop. So that is filling the, scratching the RPG itch for me right now. I do have in the hopper that I'm working on my next World of Darkness Chronicle. I've shared little bits of it here and there online on Twitter. Every now and then I'll feed a snippet out there or collect some photographs that I steal from around the web and always try to credit them, of course. But put bits of that planning into those tweets. I also am, I've got an 11-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I love playing board games with them. My 11-year-old actually likes RPGs. She plays with her Girl Scout troop, and every now and then I'll run the game for the Girl Scout troop.
She sounds awesome.
God.
Yep.
What does she play? I'm so intrigued by this.
Bard.
They play a lot of D&D right now because I think it's probably just the most accessible.
Yeah.
But they also have experimented with a couple of other things, but all like generally in the kind of fantasy realm. My daughter likes Harry Potter, and there's one of the other girls in the troop likes Harry Potter. So I think they're kind of drawn to the same sort of fancy that can populate the world, where you look a little deeper and there's wonder there. But my 5-year-old is very driven by, he loves board games. He loves moving the pieces around the board, and we play things like, Cauldron Quest or Labyrinth or Enchanted Forest. I've tried to play RPGs with him. He is less excited about those than he is about, like Luigi's Mansion 3 or even board games. But I mean, he likes the idea of being able to pretend to be somebody. So, I think in the future I will, and I'm very much looking forward to playing RPGs with him in the future.
Or just unleash him on a LARP. Why not? He's ready to go.
Yeah, I call him, I say, when I drive him home from school, I'm like, are you little Victor? And he's like, no, I'm big Victor. I'm Godzilla Victor. So, maybe he's this kind of little terror monster running around the LARP and spitting fire at people.
Honestly, I don't think it's a bad idea, like LARPing for kids, because they've already got the sense of no, this is who I am now. My life is committed to now performing this character,
and they do, right? Like at his school, he pretends to be, me and Connor, we pretended that I was Iron Man today, and he was whoever else he's, or I mean, it all comes back to cops and robbers, right? I mean, a game is just, it imposes rules on that let's pretend sort of attitude.
It's also kind of just a great way to enforce daycare without actually having to pay. Just give it to a LARP group, and then you're fine for a couple of hours.
Your quest, you must protect this small creature. There may be a boon for you, and that's pizza.
My first love was Requiem, and so I've got to ask, do you have a particular favorite clan in either Requiem or Masquerade? Do you find yourself leaning towards playing certain clans or having a particular play style?
I like to play generally across the board. I'm one of the people who, especially if there's a kind of scenario already in mind, if the storyteller says, we need someone to do this, this, or this, I will happily jump into, again, kind of those creative constraints. But kind of given my druthers, historically for Masquerade, I have liked the Ventru, but recently, more and more, I find myself gravitating toward the Toreador. And I think that, again, comes with being in love with the night and having a sense for, just appreciating what beauty and wonder can be extracted from an awful, awful world. At the same time, I really love all of the kind of basic 7 clans, or the core 7 clans that came out originally for Vampire, just because they hit all the high notes of what vampire myth is. You've got the bestial vampire and the gangrel, and you've got the monstrous vampire and the Nosferatu and the vampire witch and the Tremere, et cetera, et cetera. For Requiem, I had always, again, being in love with kind of the dark, the Deva always drew me. I think I'm probably less able to put that into words. It's just more of an emotional kind of resonance. If you put those 5 things out on the tabletop, I will go stand in front of the Deva.
I was listening to an interview I think you did with the Gentleman Gamer on YouTube, where you talked about when you were effectively looking at what the writers were giving you for when Requiem was coming out, and you talked about the iterative process of sending back edits, and that you felt as though, and I'm trying to quote it so that it jumps your memory, because I know that would have been about a year or two ago when you discussed this, but you talked about how you would give them, it was at a 10 and you wanted to take it up to 11, and you'd send it back and say, take it again. When actually, in fact, you looking back on it, maybe I should have gone to 20 to know that difference was so significant, or what the possibilities there. Was it too much, or could we even go to 30 or 40 or 50? Can you explain that a bit more, the process, or what you mean by that? Yeah,
that is something that comes out of games design as opposed to like writing specifically. And it is, I think it's attributed to Sid Meier originally. But he was talking about, like, let's say you're making a game and here's your pirate, and your pirate has a cannon on the ship, and the pirate, the cannon does 10 damage. Okay, and 10 damage is the wrong number for it. And so what you should do is, if it's not enough, on your next iteration, the cannon does 20 damage. Or if it's too much, cut it in half. The cannon does 5. But basically, make the big leap first, and that will save you time, because you will get a much more impressionistic sense of, oh yeah, okay, it should be 20, or maybe it's 21. But if you've gone from 10 to 11 to 12 to 13 to 14, blah, 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 well, that's taken you a bunch of time, as opposed to getting much closer to begin with. Go ahead and push your boundaries as much as you can in every iteration. And if they are incorrect, great. At least you have a better sense of where they're incorrect, as opposed to just kind of incrementally pushing the change. And so, like in retrospect, those writers basically had to do a lot of work that eventually got us to the destination, but we could have gotten there much more quickly if we had just kind of taken the reins off. Right. I shouldn't have sent them back notes that say, can we get a little more out of this? It could have been like, this is a great idea. What if we took this all the way?
And those small little steps feel good while you're doing it. It doesn't feel scary on you. It feels like, oh, we're going in the right direction, probably. It feels very safe and very contained. So it's a very sort of self-satisfied way of stepping out or developing something, right?
Well, if you're paying me by the hour, I will gladly do that for you, right? But if you're paying me, like in a lot of cases, a writer is turning in work based on a word rate. So if the final accepted word or work is 10,000 words and it's taken you 50 drafts to get there, all of a sudden, you're making $1 an hour or something.
Yeah.
So it's way better to know what you don't want as opposed to maybe this is what will eventually get us to the right place. Commit. That's what I'm saying. Fucking commit.
I have a sorry, I just got a bit concerned about you screaming commit at me as a lifelong committophobe.
Commit. You personally.
No,
Come on.
I can't. I have a question about, this may have been you, or I was reading a lot about in terms of player decisions in Vampire and the idea of everything needing to cost something. We all know that, right, from inherently consuming media or playing games, choices should matter. When I was playing Vampire, every choice I made was preceded by a I think I'll do this. It hurt. And how do you kind of try and push narratives to getting that kind of visceral choice? Because for every player, things are going to hurt differently. So how do you kind of influence the game and influence the narrative so that it will hurt them eventually?
That's an excellent question. And I think that is what you see in practice, why something like World of Darkness is a bit different from something like Dungeons and Dragons. Whereas Dungeons and Dragons likes to propose, here's a situation, and now you can react to it. Whereas World of Darkness says, here's a situation, what do you do? It's a bit more proactive, and it relies on kind of the players having their own motivations, or the characters having their own motivations and wanting to see those imposed on the world. And one example here is, let's say I'm the bad guy and I'm holding the orphanage ransom, and if the moral choice to you is, do you burn down the orphanage or do you not? Is that really a choice? It's bad if I burn down the orphanage, but is that really a significant choice to make? Because the answer is obvious there. So in practicality, what you end up seeing is a lot more books or scenarios that kind of propose, here is the state of things, now what? As opposed to, here is the state of things, now go do this, now go do this, now go do this. And so, from a kind of fantasy, dungeon exploration sense, you literally follow the sequence of rooms and corridors. But a book like, Chicago by Night or Fall of London kind of proposes this overall scenario and says, here's a bunch of different things happening. What do you do? Your characters, knowing that this is going on, what do they want to do to make the world better for them?
That sounds horrifying. I hate it, and it's great. As someone who has problems with making decisions and committing to things, you've created my nightmare. Well done, you.
She's a delight to play role-playing games with, of the horror variety or the thriller variety. It's truly a delight running those games for Ellen.
But it's edifying to hear that, right? Because people play games for different reasons.
Yes.
When we all sit around the table together, there are people who literally, they don't want to play. They don't want to make a decision. They just want to hang out with their friends.
Yeah.
So playing the game to them is a social time. And there are other players who are kind of more, the actor style players who, okay, what do I see? Okay, here's what I do, and everyone appreciate it. People play to see outcomes come from their actions. So what is any individual getting from the game can be very, very different around a game table.
Yeah, what's my point of fun in or the player's point of fun around the table? What's their goal there?
I'm gonna grab onto that. Even beyond fun, it can be engagement.
Yes.
Fun is great. Fun is an outcome. Fun is a kind of engagement. But there are movies that are fantastic that were very moving that I never want to see again. Right? I'm glad I saw this, but oh god, I never want to watch this again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Justin, where are just about to come to our end here, unfortunately, but we wanted to ask you, are you working on anything right at the moment that you can talk about? Because obviously there's sometimes where you can't talk about things, but is this a moment where you can talk about things you're working on?
I am currently working at Funcom in the North Carolina office. I am working on a game based on the Dune IP.
No way!
So being able to visit Arrakis and make your way there. So that's one of the things I'm working on right now. So it's funny, even though I'm not working on the World of Darkness literary property, I am working on other games and other literary properties.
Yeah,
that's
that is
fantastic.
so fucking cool. I'm sorry, I was just very, very shocked by that. That's awesome.
It is kind of interesting that you've mentioned that, because it is a question that I did have for you, is that in terms of where you're at with your career now, do you still have bucket list items, whether that is in writing or something completely different? Are there things that you either haven't had a chance to kind of dive into or would like to explore more further that you potentially maybe haven't had the chance to really kind of dip your toes into yet?
The grail for me is always the original. I don't want to call it a property necessarily, that, I don't want you to think that, I just want to make something that people consume, but, something that's wholly original. So I've, worked on World of Darkness, obviously. I've worked on Assassin's Creed. I'm working on Dune. I've always worked on stuff that basically other people own. So ultimately, I want to get to a situation where I've made this, amazing and wonderful thing that's mine, right? That wholly belongs to me, and I am the complete auteur for it. I got complete creative control over it. And the reason that remains on a bucket list for me is I don't know what that is yet. I've got a couple, there's plenty of things I like and I'm interested in, but, like I was talking about earlier on, what is that spark? What is that thing that pushes you forward? Always have something to say when you're writing. I want this thing that I've created, but I don't know what the thing is yet. So that's what I'm chasing right now.
When you create it, we'll be the first ones looking for it. Justin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming onto our podcast and talking about your process, about the industry, and about your kind of journey in the games. You talked earlier about Twitter. Where can people find you on Twitter?
Yeah, I am generally active on Twitter, depending on workload, but I am JACHILLI on Twitter. I have a poor neglected blog that I think probably hasn't been updated in 2 years or so, but it's just myname.com, justinachilli.com. I surely said something brilliant there, so please go read it.
He did. I've been reading it. It's very good. I have, actually. It was really informative.
Even if his Neopets are dying.
But that's the long and short of it for me, and I've had a good time here, so thanks so much for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
We have been Ellen, who you can find at...
Oh, yes. I'm not on Twitter, but I am on Instagram at EllieBean96.
Sean?
Oh, goodness, this is always a treat.
You always forget.
My Twitter handle is at Slurl, which is a portmanteau of my first and last name. There you go, spoiled that. SLIERL.
And you can find me at Bonding Chris. I'll let everyone know that you can find this podcast and any other podcasts at Baby Beard Media. Just search Baby Beard Media. We also have an exciting announcement for next week. We're going to be joined by Jay Gray, who's the social media ambassador from Our Talzorian Games, with an exciting announcement that we can't talk about just yet, but it's very exciting. But thank you once again, Justin. You've been a fantastic guest, and it's been truly a delight, and it's been an honor for me to listen to you talk. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Truly,
so much fun here.
Truly living up to the title of Wonderful Man.
Goodbye, you sweet, wonderful man.
To give satisfaction.
And thanks for listening. See you on the next episode.
Where
Bye.
We'll talk to another wonderful man.
We do. Adelaide by Night is a Baby Beard Media production. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And all our podcasts are available on Spreaker, YouTube, and all good podcatchers. Portions of the materials are the copyrights and trademarks of White Wolf Entertainment AB and are used with permission. All rights reserved. For more information, please visit white-wolf.com. This season of Roll to Cast is made by fans, for fans, and is not officially licensed material of White Wolf Entertainment.